Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. All right, so we're going to talk about fractioning reps in workouts today. And by fractioning, we just mean how you actually break up larger sets. So for example, if we look at one of the previous open workouts with heavy squat cleans, double unders, and toes to bar, and there were sets of 25 toes to bar, most people had some sort of plan for how they were going to break that up, right? It may have been 15 and 10. They may have approached it with doing sets of 2 and 3 from the start, but we'll essentially call that a fractioning strategy. And when we're thinking about how we are going to fraction reps, there's a lot of different variables that we want to keep track of. And there's a lot of just intuition that's developed from experience of trying different fractioning strategies, trying different scenarios in training, and just really building up an intuitive understanding of what strategy is going to be appropriate for you and how you actually react to different combinations of movements and total volume of repetition. So, John, if you're coaching an athlete on how they should think about breaking up their reps in a workout, what are you usually going to tell them?
The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what their capacity is like on that movement when they're fresh. So if it's a gymnastic movement, it's maybe, okay, what is your max unbroken set for that movement? If it's a loaded barbell movement, it's maybe looking at what their 1 rep max is on that movement. And then maybe if I've done some other testing with them, I'll know what kind of battery they have when it comes to that particular movement. So understanding their kind of fresh capacity is then going to help to figure out the plan for under fatigue or in a Metcon or whatever situation they're doing it in. So my general rule on gymnastics work is don't go over half of your max unbroken set. So let's say you have 10 ring muscle ups as your best unbroken set. Well, in a Metcon, you shouldn't really be going over 5. You know, if there's a workout that requires 6 ring muscle ups per round, you probably want to break those because you're going to get through 1, maybe 2 sets before you start to hit that fatigue. And hitting a fatigue is just going to make it harder to come back into another round. So when it comes to gymnastics, 50% of max reps tends to be that kind of sweet spot where above it, you're going to fatigue too fast. Below it might be not as efficient as you could be.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it's important to note also, especially since we talked about this on other podcasts, that improving your maximum capacity doesn't always improve your ability to repeat sets.
Sure.
But understanding what your maximum capacity is can give you an idea of where you should start with your attempts, right? As far as breaking up gymnastics movements or understanding how difficult a certain barbell movement is going to be for you. And on that note as well, people will vary in terms of what percentage of their maximum sets of gymnastics movements they can actually repeat. And that's fine. You can learn that over time. But I think what we're saying is that 50% is probably a good starting point. And then you may want to adjust up or down based upon what type of athlete you are. And you'll learn that through your experience.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's also worth noting with that some movements are going to be more susceptible to muscle fatigue and muscle failure than other movements. I think part of it comes down to the amount of muscle used. So if you're doing something which is very much a kind of single muscle group, that's going to fatigue a little bit faster than if it's a movement involving multiple muscle groups. So you look at something like a strict handstand push-up, triceps, delts, maybe a little bit of upper back. There's not too much muscle being used there. So if it fatigues, you haven't got a lot to back up on. And I think that knowing which movements are going to be worse under fatigue is important as well. So handstand push-up, very hard to recover from if you hit actually muscle fatigue there. A pull-up, especially if you're doing a kipping or a butterfly pull-up, there's a little more leeway because you can use that kip even if your grip's getting fatigued, if your pulling is getting fatigued, there's something else you can fall back on to get through the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. There's more ability to compensate or use another strategy to actually complete the movement.
Sure.
And on your point as well about specific muscle groups, I think that people also start to develop an understanding for them of what muscle groups tend to hit that absolute muscle endurance fatigue, right? For some folks, their rotator cuffs tend to blow up on just about everything they do, right? So those people are going to have a really hard time with things like strict handstand push-ups. And other people tend to have their forearms blow up on everything they do. So those people are often going to struggle more when it comes to something like rope climbs, right? Because if they hit that point of just hitting a forearm pump, they're completely shot. So there is something to that as well, as far as thinking about, okay, for me, not just what movement, but what muscle group tends to sort of get that big pump that just puts me out of commission for the remainder of the workout.
Yeah. And I think, like legless rope climbs are a great example of that. I mean, we've seen it time and time again in competition where you fail a legless rope climb. Well, you've got to give yourself like a minute, 2 minutes of rest before you try again. And if you try again and fail, well, realistically, your workout's over. Like you just don't come back from that kind of fatigue that quickly.
Yeah, and I think that brings up the point of, I think you mentioned it before, just understanding what battery is and what that sort of feels like versus more of just like a metabolic fatigue versus a more muscle endurance focused fatigue, since those are all slightly different things. So if we think about something like a legless rope climb, that typically is going to be something more like a battery type of situation where you're doing a pretty hard effort, and then you're resting a certain amount of time and doing another pretty hard effort. We can also see this with things like muscle ups in certain contexts or heavy barbell based work. And that doesn't give you that same burning feeling per se as maybe, high repetition sets of push-ups or something like that, right? Where push-ups are probably going to be more of like a localized muscle endurance type of fatigue. And so, physiologically, who knows what all the exact differences are in terms of substrates being utilized or different processes to filter out different kinds of waste or the nervous system regulating whether or not you feel good enough to go again. It's kind of a mess and we're not necessarily sure what exactly is happening there. But as an athlete, you should intuitively think about those being different types of feelings, right? That, if muscle ups are hard for you, something like a burpee bar muscle up is going to be more of a battery type of situation where it's like, okay, I have to try really, really hard to get each of these reps done. And then that is going to feel different than, a very high repetition, moderately loaded dumbbell push press, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of this can be kind of discovered during training. And it's when you want to be figuring out which movements or which muscle groups fatigue fastest for you. And then working on compensation strategies to avoid that happening mid-workout. And whether that's, how do I need to break up reps with this movement to allow myself to stay, or to avoid fatigue, I guess. Or what total capacity can I handle in a workout? Does it matter if I have 150 pull-ups to do? Does it matter if I'm doing them one at a time, or am I just going to blow up at 80 reps regardless of how I break them up?
Yeah, I think that idea of functional volume is super, super important. And we're recording this right after 20.2, which was a 20-minute AMRAP with a lot of toes to bar. And people are doing potentially hundreds and hundreds of repetitions of toes to bar, right? That there were 6 reps per round, and a lot of people are getting well over 10 rounds. A lot of people are getting 15 plus rounds. Higher level athletes are getting more than 20. The elite are getting close to 30. So this is a lot of repetitions of toes to bar. And in some discussions with people, they've been asking about different toes to bar fractioning strategies, and should they break it up 3 and 3, or should they go 3, 2, 1, or should they start unbroken? And not that these things don't matter, because it is a good idea to actually have some sort of plan relative to your capacity for how you're going to approach the toes to bar. But I also think that people sometimes think that they're going to have some sort of magical fractioning strategy that's going to get them additional rounds on a workout. And for sure, having a plan is helpful. But if you have not done the functional volume in training of potentially 120 plus toes to bar in a single workout, it's not like you're going to come up with some great plan that's going to make you able to do 40 more toes to bar than you've ever done in one workout before. There comes a point where it's just like, well, after I do 72 toes to bar, kind of no matter what the context is, I can't really do them anymore. After I do 35 strict handstand push-ups, no matter what the context is, I can't really do them anymore. And that's something that you should be aware of as an athlete, and your training should be structured such that you're actually increasing increasing the volume of repetitions that you're doing in different types of scenarios so that you are building up that functional volume.
And I think the same thing can be said when you look at the people who are in that situation, whether maybe they ran through the workout on Friday and they struggled with the toes to bar, and they're like, okay, I need to break up the toes to bar a little bit earlier or a little bit more. And then they go ahead and repeat the workout on Monday. And it's like, well, you actually haven't recovered from Friday. Yeah. And now all of a sudden, where you struggled to do, 100 reps on Friday because your total volume wasn't there, now you're going to do another 100 reps and expect it to be better. It's like, well, no. You need to have actually, A, recovered properly, and B, changed your training volume.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I think we've talked about before with regards to functional volume, especially for something like the open, where it's not, like you said, just the 100 plus reps of toes to bar you're doing on one day. It's that you're going to do that again a few days later, probably not enough days later to actually be fully recovered. So, folks thinking about how much volume they need to actually get done in training need to think about the potential for redoing these types of workouts on a rest of 2 to 3 days. So that's a pretty impressive amount of volume. And, I'm not necessarily suggesting that everyone should start going out and doing 400 toes to bar per week from now on, but that is something to potentially be aware of in terms of the volume, not just of one session, but of those repeat workouts just a few days apart.
And as much as I hate them in principle, you see those programs where people do like, okay, day 1 push-up, day 2 push-ups. And, they keep going for like 100 days. And, as stupid as that is from a training principle standpoint, there is some kind of, I guess, truth to it in the sense that understanding that building volume across time, you're going to be able to do more by the end, even if you're doing that and you're not giving yourself ample recovery time, etc. But adding in that volume into your training in the long term is going to help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of having some sort of linear progression like that, I mean, like you mentioned, that's probably a little bit overly simplified for people who are doing CrossFit, that's not just going to immediately translate into results for them. And then especially for people who have some more training experience, you sort of tap out your capacity to adapt to that type of linear progression pretty quickly. But there still are some principles there as far as thinking about, okay, we did this much this day or this week, and now let's see if we can do a little bit more, and just sort of chop up the way that reps are presented in different workouts, but still being aware of that total volume and really just trying to push that on a session over session and a week over week basis. So if we think about not just the total volume of repetitions, but I guess the movements that they're paired with and the types of scenarios that they show up in, what do we want to think about as far as movement interference related to fractioning strategies and muscle endurance?
My favorite example of this is the workout from, was it last open? The one that had the bar facing burpees and the bar muscle ups.
Yeah,
I think it was last open.
Yeah, it was the first open of 2019.
Yeah. And I think that was a great example of either people not understanding or just not realizing that, that the pushing motion within a burpee of constantly getting up off the ground was affecting their catch and their press out in a bar muscle up. And I saw people fail bar muscle ups who turned over and got on top of the bar and then literally couldn't press out at the top because the amount of muscle fatigue that had accumulated before that was just too much for them to then run through a rep like normal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just the exact same movement that causes fatigue, but it's, if you're doing the same pattern over and over again, that's obviously going to cause fatigue. And there's also an element as well that isn't always so obvious, where it may seem like, let's say, a combination of handstand push-ups and kipping pull-ups, where it's like, oh yeah, these are going to be a pushing and a pulling movement, so it's sort of opposing. And it's like, well, actually, your rotator cuff is being used pretty extensively in both of those movements. So you will start to get a lot of interference and find that you may struggle more to do pull-ups than you would expect, based upon having done handstand push-ups because you just sort of smoked the entire shoulder complex. So being aware of that feeling of interference and the different types of contexts that it's going to show up, and maybe having some sort of hierarchy of, okay, these are totally opposing movements that there's probably not going to be a bunch of interference. Like let's say, I don't know, something like an air squat and a kipping pull-up, right? You're probably not going to get a ton of interference between those movements. And then things that are maybe not really the same, but are going to have some interference. So let's say we could use deadlifting and handstand push-ups, for example, right? Sort of a classic CrossFit couplet in Diane. And you may not realize it as much, but you are utilizing your upper back and your shoulders to pull quite a bit and to stabilize that barbell, as well as actually push and stabilize yourself in a handstand push-up position. So sometimes people can get caught off guard by the difficulty they may experience in shoulder fatigue with movements like that. And then I think the next stage may be something like your example, John, of burpees and bar muscle ups, or burpees and sort of like a muscle snatchy type of situation where it's like, yeah, you're dealing with this horizontal pushing movement. It's not always immediately clear that that's going to have some sort of impact in those other pieces. And then we have something that is just, really the same idea over and over and over again, where it's like, okay, if you're doing, let's say, chest to bar pull-ups and then maybe something else and then ring muscle ups, you're pretty obviously going to have some challenges based upon the total volume of upper body pulling that is just going to be, okay, more pulling. Great. All of a sudden I can't turn over a muscle up. And that's not always the most surprising thing in those scenarios.
Yeah. And as much as there are kind of the obvious ones, I think there are some more subtle ones that people don't realize. If you do a high volume toaster bar and then jump into ring muscle ups, you realize just how much work your abs are actually doing when you're doing ring muscle ups. And there's a lot of movements like that kind of cross over that aren't immediately obvious as, yeah, this is going to feel tough putting these two together. That I think is something which you kind of discover in training. The more workouts you do and the more variation you have within that, you find those combinations which to you really, really mess you up. And sometimes you don't find it out to the open.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's real. Something else worth mentioning too is just the concept of overall metabolic fatigue and how that can impact muscle endurance and fractioning strategies. So I think a lot of people are vaguely aware, if not totally aware, of this type of interference that we're discussing. But people will also have a lot of trouble doing larger sets of, say, kipping pull-ups or handstand push-ups or something if they're just tired in general. And it's not always being tired from doing a specific movement combination, but once you hit kind of a threshold of overall fatigue where you've crossed some sort of red line for yourself and you're breathing too heavy and you've kind of saturated yourself with a lot of metabolic waste, you'll just struggle in general, right? You'll struggle to move in a coordinated fashion. You'll struggle to recover between sets of things. Everything will just feel a lot harder. So people can sometimes get caught off guard where they're like, great, I've got John's recommendation. I can usually do 15 unbroken strict handstand push-ups. This is going to be awesome. I'm going to go, we'll be conservative. He usually says 50%, but I think I'm going to go with sets of 6. This is going to be perfect. This is an awesome plan for me. And then they get into a set of strict handstand push-ups and, all they were doing before was, let's say, I don't know, rowing and Russian kettlebell swings. So they think that they're going to have no problem knocking out sets of 6 on strict handstand push-ups because there isn't too much interference there, less than 50%, no issues, but they went too fast. And then that just global metabolic fatigue makes it extremely challenging for them to maintain those larger sets because they just, as a whole, they're not able to kind of clear that metabolic waste and retain the coordination necessary to knock out those sort of more difficult muscle endurance based movements. So I think that's something that a lot of people can get caught off guard with, just going a little bit too fast and being more tired than they think. And that has a much larger impact on their ability to sustain muscle endurance in a conditioning piece.
Yeah. And I think on that same note, you then get, sticking with that strict handstand push-up one. So, okay, strict handstand push-up, you need to be able to maintain pretty good tension through the body. You start doing rowing and kettlebell swings before that, maybe you're breathing heavy, maybe you're finding it harder to maintain tension. So maybe your strict handstand push-up becomes less efficient. And it would take what you thought you previously could do in terms of repeatable sets. All of a sudden, you're moving less efficiently. And so that number drops down.
And there's an element as well in those muscle endurance-based movements. You see it with muscle ups or strict handstand push-ups, or maybe like a heavy squat or a deadlift, where if you do one rep that's a bit too hard, that just kind of pushes you over some sort of cliff, right? Where, it's feeling difficult, things are somewhat challenging, but you're moving reasonably well. And you do 1 or 2 reps where you kind of have to, grind it out and get a little bit of like a Valsalva grunt to get to your lockout, and then you're just a mess after that, right? That you've crossed some sort of line that shouldn't have been crossed and you can't do anything. So being aware of where that line is for you and understanding that fatigue in terms of how you feel and what that perception is isn't always linear, right? It's not this sort of gradual ramp up into being too tired to actually continue, that there are these almost quantum jumps as far as, okay, I'm this level of fatigued. Oops, I did 1 rep that's too hard. And all of a sudden I've made a huge jump in terms of my rate of perceived exertion. I went from a 7.5 to a 9.5 immediately, and I can no longer keep moving.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, again, that drop off is something that needs to be established in training to know where that point is, and to understand what the signals your body is sending you, like understand what that means. Like understand different muscle fatigue feelings. Is it the kind of thing that's terminal, or is it something that I can recover on with a short amount of rest?
So we're talking about having just an understanding on an intuitive basis of what you should be shooting for in terms of different sets, as well as maybe a more, let's say, calculated plan as far as knowing what different percentages are of sets and how you should feel based upon that. How do you coach people to think about how much they should stick to a plan versus how much they should be adapting on the fly?
I mean, everything has to be adaptable. There's nothing so rigid that you should stick to regardless of how you're feeling. Especially when it comes down to CrossFit workouts. I think when you look at something that's maybe a little more of a monostructural piece, like say you're doing a 5K run and you kind of have a pacing strategy and you kind of have that plan going into it. And maybe that's okay to stick to it a little bit more if you're feeling under fatigue, because you've done the training. There's no external factors that are really going to affect that as much. But I think when you look at something that's mixed modality, you have to be a little more flexible, and you have to be willing to kind of throw away the plan and say, okay, I need to focus on getting through this movement, or I need to focus on, breaking up these reps to avoid hitting muscle fatigue. And it's just it's knowing when you need to switch things and hopefully not leaving it too late.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, just about you want to have a plan, and you should absolutely have a plan, but all of those plans need to be ready to be ditched at any second based upon what's going on. And there's not necessarily a clear heuristic or a clear rule on when and why you should ditch your plan, but that's what you learn through training, right? That a lot of the value in training comes from making plans for how you're going to approach a specific workout or a specific set of intervals, then doing it and seeing how it feels. And then you can take those lessons that you learn from that and then hopefully apply them when you're actually competing. And that folks who are really, really good are often just making the right decision in those scenarios in an intuitive way that other people tend to potentially be too rigid in terms of trying to stick to their plan, or far too chaotic in terms of just getting overwhelmed by their feelings of fatigue or doubting whether or not they chose the right pace, and not being willing to kind of find that line and sort of suffer a little bit more than they want to in order to keep pushing. So that it's a trade-off, and there's always going to be people who are going to make mistakes in just about every direction possible. But ideally through training, you just kind of decrease that cluster of mistakes that you make and get closer and closer to that kind of perfect pacing scenario.
Yeah. And training really is that time to kind of make mistakes, figure out what doesn't work, figure out what works, and just slowly kind of hone in on making a perfect workout performance, which I've done, several thousand times before, but not many people can do it perfectly.
Yeah, it's it's one of your strong suits, John. It's just a constant stream of perfection.
Some view it as a weakness, actually. But no, it's a curse. It's a curse.
Yeah, I can see how it just might make those around you a little bit uncomfortable.
And what happens when we're uncomfortable? We make a difference, or something like that. Anyway.
Yeah, I think I saw that on Instagram the other day. Fitspo.
Yeah. Was it the one that was underneath a picture of a kitten hanging onto a tree?
No, the kitten was hanging on some power lines.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, great. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.